The file says her name is Destiny, 8 years old, likes drawing horses. She's been in foster care for 3 years. You open her file on a Tuesday morning, coffee going cold next to your keyboard, and you have about 4 minutes before your next intake call. That's the job. 4 minutes per child if you're lucky. You've been told to optimize Destiny's case. That's the word they used, optimize. Like she was a spreadsheet. Like the goal was to find the most efficient path to close the loop and free up the slot. She wasn't a slot. She was a kid who drew horses. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what they asked you to do, you need to understand how you got into a room where that question was even possible. You didn't go into Child Protective Services because you wanted a career, and you went in because you had a cousin who spent 4 years in the system and came out the other side not quite whole, and you thought if there were more people like you on the inside, maybe that could change. That's what you told yourself in 2018 when you started your social work degree. And you still believed it the morning you walked into your first placement office, a regional CPS hub serving roughly 400 families across 2 counties. Your supervisor handed you a stack of 28 cases on day 1. The state caseload standard is 17 active cases per worker. Nobody mentioned that. What they did mention was the software, a case management system called SACWIS, which stands for Statewide Automated Child Welfare Information System. Everything lives in SACWIS. Every visit, every call, every placement decision, and every metric they use to evaluate your performance. Green means the case is on track. Yellow means it needs attention. Red means it's flagged. And flagged cases get reviewed by a supervisor, which means scrutiny, which means documentation, which means time you don't have. The goal, unspoken but visible in every metric, is to keep things green. You ask your supervisor on week 2 about a case that looks wrong to you. A 12-year-old boy, Marcus, has been in his 4th placement in 8 months. Every time he gets moved, his file gets updated and his case clicks back to green. Fresh placement, fresh start. Clock reset. Why does it keep going green, you ask? He keeps getting moved. She looks at you over the top of her glasses, the way you look at someone who just asked why the sun rises. Because placement is an action item, she says. Completed action items move the metric. Marcus wasn't getting better. He was getting moved. Those are 2 completely different things, and the system couldn't tell the difference. You keep your mouth shut. You're new. You have 28 cases. You figure you'll figure out the right levers to pull. What you don't know yet is that the levers aren't attached to anything that helps children. They're attached to a machine that needs to be fed. And the more you learn about how that machine works, the harder it becomes to pretend you're not feeding it too. Nobody mentioned this when you took the job. The foster care system is not primarily funded to keep families together. It's funded per placement day. On Title IV, E of the Social Security Act reimburses states for a percentage of every single day a child spends in foster care. Not every day a family gets counseling. Not every day a parent completes a treatment program. Every day a child is placed. That's the incentive structure. Day 1 of a child in foster care, the clock starts. Federal dollars start flowing, and those dollars don't flow if the child goes home. Reunification services, the programs that are supposed to help parents get their kids back, those come out of a different budget, a smaller one that routinely gets cut first when the state is short on money. You don't understand this on day 1. You start to understand it around month 4, when you're assigned to a case involving a mother named Tanya. And Tanya had lost custody of her 2 daughters after a domestic violence incident involving her ex. She was out of the relationship. She had a restraining order, she had a new apartment, a job, and she was 18 months sober. By every reasonable measure, she had done what was asked. You go to your supervisor and say you should start the reunification process. Tanya is compliant. She's stable. The kids are in a placement that wasn't great. They'd been moved twice. They were acting out in school. Your supervisor opens the budget tab on her computer and turns it toward you. We don't have funding allocated for reunification services in this quarter, she says. We'd need a court motion, a new home study, supervised visit transport. That's $2,000 we don't have. $2,000. The placement was costing 10 times that. And it could keep going indefinitely because Title 4E would keep reimbursing it. But $2,000 to get those girls home? Not in the budget. You file the motion anyway, on your own time. You write the documentation yourself. 3 months later, Tanya's case gets transferred to another worker when you hit your capacity limit. You never find out what happened after that. The system moves on. That's what the system does. That's what starts keeping you up at night. Tanya's case wasn't a bug. It wasn't an oversight. It was the system working exactly as designed. Every family that stayed broken kept the money flowing. Every child who stayed placed kept the metrics green. And every worker who asked too many questions got transferred, overloaded, or quietly managed out. You're 3 years in before you fully understand that. And by then, you've started to become part of the machine you thought you were fighting. The word optimization enters your vocabulary at a regional meeting in the spring of your 3rd year. A consultant had been brought in. Someone from a policy firm with a name like 3 initials and the word solutions at the end. He has slides, clean ones. He talks about throughput rates, discharge velocity, and bed day costs. He says the region is underperforming on permanency outcomes, and that his firm has identified several friction points in the pipeline. Children. He called them permanency outcomes. 847 days. That's how long the average child in your region spent in the foster system before reaching what he called permanency. And the goal was to get that down to 600, not by improving services, not by funding reunification faster, by moving children through the pipeline faster, whatever it took. A colleague leans over and whispers, "Did he just say we need to move kids faster?" You nod. "Faster to where?" she says. That was the right question, and nobody in that room had a good answer. The project rolls out over the next quarter. Every worker in your region gets a performance dashboard tied to discharge velocity. Your cases are color-coded not just by compliance status now, but by days in system. The longer a child has been placed without a permanency outcome, the redder the case. Long-term foster kids, kids with disabilities, kids with complex trauma histories, kids whose biological parents were still in the picture but struggling. Those kids turn the dashboards red. And red cases reflect on your review. And there's a specific permanency outcome that generates federal bonus money. Adoption. The Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997 created what are sometimes called adoption incentive payments. States receive federal bonuses for every finalized adoption above a baseline. The more adoptions, the more money. Now hear this out. There are absolutely children for whom adoption is the right outcome, where biological family reunification is genuinely not safe, not possible. You've worked those cases. You support those outcomes. In practice, adoption incentives create pressure to pursue termination of parental rights faster. And termination of parental rights, TPR, is irreversible. You cannot unterminate a parent's rights. Once it's done, it's done. The biological family is severed legally and permanently, and in a system under pressure to hit adoption numbers. Workers and attorneys and judges face pressure to file for TPR even when the parent is trying, even when there might be another path. You're assigned to a case during this period. A father named Jerome. His daughter had been in care for 14 months after he lost his apartment and couldn't provide stable housing. He has since gotten into transitional housing. He's attending every required visit. He's doing everything right. His case is red on the dashboard. 414 days in system. A supervisor flags it for permanency review. In the conference, the recommendation on the table is to begin TPR proceedings and move toward adoption placement. You tell them Jerome is compliant, that he's hit every benchmark. Okay, they say the child has been in care too long. You say the child has a father who wants her back. They point at the dashboard. You leave that meeting and sit in your car for 20 minutes because you just watched a room full of people use a metric to build a case for erasing a father from his daughter's life. Not because he was dangerous, because the dashboard was red. You write a counter recommendation. You document Jerome's progress. You argue for an extension of the reunification window. You also start keeping a personal log. Every case, every meeting, every number. Because you're beginning to understand that documentation is the only thing standing between the truth and what the system wants the truth to look like. That brings us back to Destiny. By the time her file lands on your desk, and you've seen enough to know that optimize is a word that meant different things to different people in that building. To the consultant, it meant discharge velocity. To your supervisor's supervisor, it meant federal reimbursement ratios. To the attorneys, it meant billable hours. To Destiny, it meant being moved for the 5th time in 4 years. She had come into care at age 4. Neglect. Her mother had a serious substance abuse problem and no support network. Renee had been working a recovery program off and on for years. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The kind of case where the right intervention at the right moment could change everything. The kind of case where the system usually decides the clock has run out. The previous worker on her case had filed for TPR 8 months earlier. Renee had relapsed once, not after a period of 12 months of documented sobriety. Once. And the system used that one relapse to begin the process of erasing her from her daughter's life permanently. When you take over the case, Renee is 7 months clean. You confirm this through her treatment provider directly. She's clean, she's enrolled, and she's asking every week about Destiny. The TPR process is already in motion. Your job, as your supervisor frames it, is to manage the permanency transition, meaning help move Destiny toward adoptive placement. Close the loop. You request a meeting with the TPR attorney to review the file. He's surprised you called. The case is pretty settled, he says. What's the concern? You tell him Renee is 7 months clean. You tell him she has never missed a visit. You know what you tell him? Destiny has asked about her mother every single time a caseworker has spoken to her. He pauses. Then he says something you'll remember for a long time. The wheels are already moving on this one. Stopping them is expensive, and it's not going to look good on the Q3 report. The Q3 report. He wasn't wrong about the mechanics. Stopping a TPR process midway costs legal fees. It reopens scheduling. It delays the adoption incentive payment. It makes a green case go yellow. It makes the dashboard look bad. And in a system under performance pressure, a case that looks bad is a worker's problem, not the system's problem. You request an emergency review hearing. You submit Renee's treatment documentation directly to the judge. Your supervisor calls you into her office. She tells you you're creating a liability, that the TPR had been properly filed, that you're going outside your lane, that if you continue to disrupt active permanency proceedings, it will go in your performance review. You say you have documentation that the case has changed materially since the TPR was filed. She says, sometimes the system has to make hard calls and keep moving. You go back to your desk and draft a formal complaint to the State Child Welfare Ombudsman. That was a Thursday. By Monday, your caseload has been reassigned and you've been placed on a case transition review, which is the administrative equivalent of being put on a shelf while they figure out what to do with you. Destiny's TPR is finalized 6 weeks later. Renee appeals. Appeals in TPR cases have a very low success rate. Less than 10% nationally, according to a 2019 review by the Juvenile Law Center. You never find out how her appeal goes. By the time it's filed, you've been reassigned to a different region entirely. The system moves you, same as it moved the children. Nobody talks about this part of foster care. A significant portion of it is run by private companies. They're called congregate care facilities, group homes, residential treatment centers, and some of them are enormous businesses. A private residential treatment center can receive anywhere from $3,000 to over $15,000 per month per child, depending on the state contract and the level of care claimed. These facilities have lobbyists. They have PACs. They make campaign contributions in states with large foster populations. And they have a direct financial interest in keeping beds full. In 2018, a federal law called the Family First Prevention Services Act was passed specifically to reduce the use of congregate care and redirect funding toward community-based family support programs. It was a meaningful step. Implementation was left to the states, and many states slow-rolled it. Several sought waivers to delay the congregate care restrictions for years. Why? Because the facilities they were supposed to be reducing had lobbyists, contracts, and a lot of money invested in not being reduced. Children with behavioral diagnoses are the most profitable segment of this industry, because a behavioral diagnosis justifies a higher level of care designation, which justifies a higher reimbursement rate from the state. In the region you worked, a child who was acting out after their third placement could be referred for a behavioral assessment. That assessment could result in a diagnosis. That diagnosis could justify placement in a higher-cost residential facility, and the state would pay for it. Nobody asked whether the acting out was because the child had been moved 3 times and had no stable attachment to any adult in their life. Nobody wrote that in the assessment. Treating trauma as a billing code is not medicine, but it is, apparently, efficient. And the people running these facilities are not villains in trench coats. That's the part that makes this so hard to hold. The clinical workers you met were often skilled, overworked, and exhausted. They believed in what they were doing. The system around them is what's broken, but broken systems still have beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries of this one are not the children. The 2 facilities implicated in the Texas investigation had collectively received over $400 million in state contracts over a decade. The lead executives had continued to receive their salaries throughout the investigation period. The children involved had continued to be placed there because the contract had not expired, and renewing a contract requires less paperwork than ending one. You file 4 formal complaints during your time in that system, about individual cases, about placement practices, about the dashboard metrics, about the consultant's methodology. 2 are closed without response. 1 is referred back to your supervisor, who was one of the people you'd complained about. 1 generates a letter acknowledging receipt. That was it. And there's a moment in this job where you stop being a person trying to fix the system and start being a person the system is using. You're not sure exactly when that line is, but you know you crossed it. Every case you marked complete that should have stayed open. Every parent you couldn't advocate for because you didn't have the hours. Every child you watched cycle through their 4th, 5th, 6th placement, because stability was not a metric that moved dashboards. Each one of those was a choice. You made it. The system asked you to, and you said yes because you were tired, because you had 30 cases, because your review was in 2 weeks, and because you had told yourself that staying inside the machine was the only way to help from within. That's the story the system wants you to tell yourself. Stay inside. Work the levers. And don't make it personal. It's also the story that keeps the machine running. You leave the job in the winter of your 5th year. You don't quit dramatically. You don't blow a whistle in a press conference. You file your last batch of cases, document everything you can, give your notice, and walk out into a parking lot where the sky is doing that thing it does in winter, where it's gray all the way to the horizon, and there's no visible line between clouds and earth. You contact 2 journalists with your documentation. 1 runs a partial story. 1 never responds. You submit what you have to the State Welfare Reform Commission that was doing a review at the time. You get a form letter back. You testify at a state legislative hearing on foster care funding 6 months later. 5 legislators attend. 1 asks a meaningful question, and the others check their phones. The system does not update you on the children after you leave. They don't send a postcard that says whether it got better. You just leave, and the cases keep moving and the dashboard keeps turning green. There are approximately 368,000 children in foster care in the United States today. 82% of them are there because of neglect, not abuse. Neglect is almost always downstream of poverty, addiction, mental illness, or housing instability, all of which are treatable with the right interventions. We have chosen as a society to respond to those problems not with treatment for families, but with removal of children and payment per placement day. The Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018 was supposed to start changing this. And in some states it is. Oregon, Michigan, New Jersey. And these states have invested in the prevention side funding and seen real results. Fewer kids entering care, better outcomes for families. But 22 states have delayed or watered down implementation because the money flows differently under Family First. And the lobbyists for congregate care don't want the money to flow differently. What would it take to actually fix this? A few things: ending per placement day federal reimbursement and replacing it with outcome-based funding, capping caseloads at the federal level with real enforcement, fully funding the prevention and reunification side of the ledger, auditing every private facility contract over a certain dollar amount annually, and paying social workers enough that they don't burn out in year 3 and leave the people who need them most with someone even newer and more overwhelmed. Researchers have been laying this out for 20 years. The policy answers exist. They've existed for a long time. What's complicated is that the current system works very well for the people being paid by it. Destiny drew horses because her mother used to take her to a farm before everything fell apart. You know this because it was in the file. 3 words in a case note, written by a worker who had probably been doing this for 4 minutes. You think about her more than you should. You think about all of them more than you should. That's not a healthy way to live. But it's the only honest response you have to what you saw. The system is still running, and the dashboards are still turning green. And somewhere, a new worker is opening their first case and thinking that staying inside is the only way to help. You hope they're right. You couldn't figure out how to make it true. If this made you angry, good. That's the right response. If this story sat with you, share it with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories from jobs that almost nobody talks about.